Jake Morrison chose a starving white mare over keeping his house, spending his last $375 on a horse everyone said would die anyway. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most reckless act of kindness can save two lives at once. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Morrison had exactly $375 in his account when he saw the white mare for the first time. He knew the exact amount because he'd checked it that morning, calculating for the third time whether he could stretch it far enough to cover another month's rent on the small ranch house he'd been leasing since his divorce. The answer was the same as it had been the previous two times, barely and only if nothing unexpected happened. On the high plains of Montana, something unexpected always happened. The November wind cut through his denim jacket as he drove his battered Ford pickup along the fence line of the old Hendricks property. He wasn't supposed to be there. The land had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since old Gerald Hendricks had passed away and his children, scattered across 3 different states, couldn't agree on what to do with the property. Legal battles had left the 200 acres in limbo, the fences falling into disrepair, the barns slowly surrendering to gravity and weather. Jake had been taking the long way home from town, putting off the moment when he'd have to face the emptiness of his house and the bills stacked on the kitchen table. That's when he saw her. At first he thought it was a ghost, some trick of the fading afternoon light playing across the brown prairie grass. But ghosts didn't move with that heartbreaking slowness, didn't lower their heads with such visible effort to reach the sparse vegetation that had somehow survived the early frost. The white mare stood in the corner of the far pasture, her coat dull and matted, her ribs visible even from a distance. She was starving, dying slowly in plain sight, forgotten or abandoned by whoever had left her there. Jake pulled the truck to the side of the road and killed the engine. For a long moment he just sat there, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching the mare attempt to graze. She was a magnificent animal beneath the neglect, or had been once. Even in her current state, he could see the fine bone structure, the noble arch of her neck, the intelligence in her dark eyes when she lifted her head to look in his direction. She'd been someone's prize once, someone's dream. Now she was left to die alone on forgotten land, visible to anyone who passed but invisible to those who should have cared. He knew what he should do. Call animal control, report the situation, let the proper authorities handle it. That's what a sensible man would do. A man who had his own problems to worry about, whose bank account was already stretched thinner than fence wire. Jake had learned a lot about being sensible in the past year. Lessons delivered by divorce lawyers and bank statements and the slow dissolution of everything he'd thought his life would be. Being sensible meant protecting yourself, not taking on more than you could handle, not letting your heart make decisions your wallet couldn't support. But Jake Morrison had also learned something else in his 42 years on this earth. He'd learned that sometimes the measure of a man wasn't found in his sensible choices, but in the moments when he chose to do what was right instead of what was smart. His grandfather had taught him that, back when Jake was a boy learning to work horses on the family ranch. A man who won't help when help is needed isn't much of a man at all, his grandfather used to say. Those words echoed in Jake's mind as he opened the truck door and stepped out into the cold November afternoon. The mare watched him approach with wary eyes, too weak to run but still alert enough to measure threat. Jake moved slowly, speaking in low, gentle tones the way his grandfather had taught him. "Easy there, girl. I'm not going to hurt you. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." He could see it all now as he got closer, the full extent of her neglect. Her hooves were overgrown and cracked. Her coat was encrusted with mud and worse. And when she shifted her weight, he could hear the painful click of joints that had been forced to carry her without proper care for far too long. But it was her eyes that broke him. They held a dim flicker of hope, as if some part of her still believed that help might come. that the world might remember she existed. Jake stood 3 feet away from her, close enough to see the shallow rise and fall of her breathing, close enough to smell the sickness that came from prolonged starvation. She was dying. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Without intervention, without someone willing to fight for her life, she would become just another forgotten casualty of human carelessness. The thought filled him with a rage so pure and hot that it burned away every sensible objection his practical mind tried to raise. He pulled out his phone and called Doc Stevens, the veterinarian who'd been serving the ranching community for 30 years. The old man answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly with age and too many years of breathing prairie dust. Jake explained the situation, his words coming faster, as the urgency of it all pressed down on him. The mare needed help now, tonight, or she might not see another sunrise. Doc Stevens was quiet for a moment, and Jake could hear the unspoken question in that silence. Who's going to pay for this? Whose responsibility is this animal? I'll pay, Jake heard himself say, the words out of his mouth before his brain could catch up and stop them. Whatever it costs, I'll cover it. There was another pause, longer this time, and Jake could almost hear the veterinarian calculating, adding up the costs of emergency treatment, the medications, the specialized feed, the time and effort required to bring a starving horse back from the brink. It's not going to be cheap, Doc Stevens said finally. Could run you a couple thousand, maybe more if there are complications. And Jake, looking at that white mare with her hopeful eyes and her dying body, said the words that would change everything. I know, I'll figure it out. Just get here as fast as you can. After he hung up, Jake stood in the cold November wind, watching the mare, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. $375 in his bank account, rent due in 2 weeks, and he'd just committed to spending thousands on a horse that wasn't even his, on land that wasn't his, for reasons that made no logical sense whatsoever. But as the white mare took a tentative step toward him, as she lowered her head just close enough for him to reach out and touch her matted mane, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Doc Stevens arrived 40 minutes later, his white veterinary truck bouncing over the rutted road that led to the abandoned Hendricks property. The old veterinarian climbed out slowly, his 70-year-old joints protesting the Montana cold, and grabbed his medical bag from the back. He'd been working with animals since before Jake was born, and there wasn't much that could shock him anymore. But when he got his first full look at the white mare standing there like a skeleton wrapped in dirty hide, Jake saw something flicker across the old man's weathered face. It might have been anger or grief, or maybe just the bone-deep weariness that came from seeing too much suffering in a world that never seemed to learn. "How long do you think she's been like this?" Doc Stevens asked, his voice tight as he approached the mare with practiced caution. Jake shook his head. "Hard to say. Property's been empty for 2 years, but she couldn't have survived this long without some food and water. Maybe someone was coming by occasionally, then stopped. Or maybe she's just tougher than she looks." The veterinarian moved around the mare slowly, his experienced hands running over her body, feeling the jutting bones, checking her legs, her hooves, her teeth. His face grew grimmer with each discovery. "She's got some fight left in her," he said finally. "More than I'd expect given her condition. But Jake, I'm going to be straight with you. This is going to be expensive, and even with treatment, there's no guarantee she'll make it." "What are we looking at?" Jake asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Doc Stevens pulled out a notebook and started writing, his pen scratching across the paper as he tallied up the damages. Severe malnutrition, obviously. Parasites, almost certainly. Her hooves need immediate attention. That's going to require a farrier. She's going to need antibiotics, vitamin supplements, specialized feed introduced gradually so we don't shock her system. And that's just for starters. He looked up at Jake, his blue eyes sharp beneath bushy gray brows. We're probably looking at $3,000 minimum, and that's if nothing else goes wrong. If she develops complications, if she needs surgery for anything, the costs could double. $3,000. Jake felt the number settle in his chest like a stone. That was 8 months of rent. It was 8. That was his truck payment for a year. That was the savings he didn't have, the security he couldn't afford to lose. His ex-wife Sarah would have laughed at him. That bitter laugh she developed during their last year together. "This is exactly why we failed," she would have said. "You can't save every stray that crosses your path, Jake. You can't fix everything that's broken." Maybe she'd been right. Maybe this was the same impulse that had driven him to take on too much at the ranch they'd tried to build together, the same tendency to see a problem and immediately shoulder the burden of solving it, regardless of whether it was practical or even possible. But Sarah wasn't here. She was 3 states away with her new life and her new husband, someone sensible who worked in an office and had a retirement plan, and probably never once considered spending his rent money on a dying horse. And Jake was here, standing in the November cold, looking at a white mare who'd been left to die by people who should have known better. "Do it," he said, the words coming out firm and clear. "Whatever she needs, do it. I'll figure out the money." Doc Stevens studied him for a long moment, and Jake wondered what the old man saw. A fool, probably. A man making a terrible decision for all the wrong reasons. But then Doc Stevens nodded slowly and turned back to his truck to gather his supplies. For the next 2 hours, Jake watched as the veterinarian worked. Doc Stevens moved with the efficiency of long practice, administering injections, taking blood samples, cleaning wounds that had gone septic from neglect. He explained each step as he went, partly for Jake's benefit and partly, Jake suspected, because talking helped the old man process the anger he felt at seeing an animal reduced to this state. "She's lucky you found her," Doc Stevens said as he checked the mare's heart rate. "Another week and it would have been too late. The antibiotics will help with the infections, but what she really needs is time and consistent care. She needs to be fed small amounts frequently, her wounds need daily cleaning, and someone needs to watch her around the clock for the first few days to make sure she doesn't go into shock." "I can do that," Jake said. "I'll take her home." The veterinarian looked at him sharply. "You got a trailer, fencing, a proper stable?" Jake's silence was answer enough. Doc Stevens shook his head, but there was something almost fond in his exasperation. "You really didn't think this through, did you?" "No, sir, I did not. But I'm committed now." The old man finished packing up his supplies and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back. "Here, this is Tom Bradley's number. He's got a horse trailer and owes me a favor. Tell him I sent you, and he'll help you transport her." "And this," he handed Jake another card, "is the feed store where you can get what she needs. Tell Martha I said to set you up with an account. You can pay her back as you're able." Jake took the cards, feeling the weight of the old man's kindness alongside the growing weight of his responsibility. "Thank you, Doc, I mean it." "Don't thank me yet," Doc Stevens said, climbing into his truck. "You got a long road ahead, son. This mare's going to need months of care before she's anywhere near healthy. You prepared for that?" Jake looked at the white mare, who was watching them both with those intelligent, hopeful eyes. She'd perked up slightly after the treatment, as if some part of her understood that help had finally arrived. "Am I prepared to spend months of my life and money I don't have trying to save a horse that might not make it? No, I'm not prepared for that at all. But I'm going to do it anyway." Doc Stevens smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from him all evening. "Your grandfather would be proud of you. He was the same kind of stubborn." That night, after Tom Bradley had helped him transport the mare to the small barn behind his rental house, after he'd set up a stall with fresh bedding and filled buckets with the specialized feed Martha had given him on credit, Jake sat on an overturned bucket and watched the white mare eat. She took small, careful bites, her body still weak, but her appetite returning with the promise of regular meals. He'd named her Hope because that's what she represented, not just her hope for survival, but his hope that doing the right thing still mattered, that sacrifice in service of something bigger than yourself still counted for something in this world. His phone buzzed with a text from his landlord asking about next month's rent. Jake looked at the message, then at Hope, then back at the message. He typed out a reply asking for an extension, knowing it might not be granted, knowing he'd just made his precarious financial situation even more impossible. But as Hope finished her meal and lowered herself carefully to the straw bedding, as she looked at him with eyes that held gratitude alongside their weariness, Jake felt something shift inside him. For the first time since his divorce, he had a purpose beyond just surviving. He had something to fight for. The first week was the hardest. Jake set his alarm for every 3 hours, dragging himself out of bed in the darkness to check on Hope, to offer her small amounts of feed, to monitor her for any signs of distress. Doc Stevens had warned him that horses in her condition could go downhill fast, their bodies so depleted that even with treatment, organ failure remained a constant threat. So Jake watched and waited, learning the rhythm of her breathing, the way she shifted her weight when something hurt. The small improvements that came so gradually they were almost invisible. He called in sick to his job at the lumber yard, burning through the few sick days he had saved. His boss, a hard man named Ray Hutchins, who'd never shown much patience for personal problems, made it clear that Jake's absence was noted and not appreciated. "When you coming back?" Ray had asked, his voice flat with disapproval. "Soon as I can," Jake had replied, not bothering to explain about the horse or the impossible choice he'd made. Ray wouldn't have understood anyway. In his world, animals were tools or livestock, valuable only insofar as they served a purpose. The idea of spending thousands of dollars on a rescue that might not survive would have seemed like pure foolishness. Maybe it was foolishness. Jake thought about that a lot during those long nights in the barn, sitting on the overturned bucket while Hope dozed fitfully in her stall. His grandfather would have called it something else, though. Character, maybe, or integrity, or simply doing what needed doing regardless of the cost. The old man had been dead for 15 years, but Jake could still hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting right there beside him. "A horse ain't just an animal, boy. She's a living thing that thinks and feels and remembers. You break a promise to a horse, you break something in yourself too." By the third day, Hope was drinking more water and showing interest in her surroundings. Her ears would perk up when Jake entered the barn, and she'd nicker softly, a sound that hit him straight in the chest every time. He started talking to her while he worked, narrating his actions, sharing his thoughts, confessing fears he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. "I don't know what I'm doing," he told her one night, his hands gentle as he cleaned the wounds on her legs. "I'm probably going to lose my house over this. My ex-wife would say I've lost my mind. But you know what? I don't care. You deserved better than what happened to you. We're going to get you through this." Hope would watch him with those intelligent dark eyes, and sometimes Jake could swear she understood every word. Maybe that was crazy. Maybe it was just his exhaustion and the strange intimacy that came from keeping vigil over another creature's suffering. But it felt real. This connection forming between them. This unspoken promise that he would see her through to the other side, no matter what it cost him. Martha from the feed store called on the 4th day. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been supplying ranchers with feed and equipment for 40 years. "Jake," she said without preamble, "Doc Stevens told me what you're doing. That's a good thing you've taken on. I wanted you to know I'm not going to charge you for the feed until the mare's back on her feet. You can pay me back then, or you can work it off helping around the store on weekends." The kindness in the offer made Jake's throat tight. He managed to thank her, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "We take care of our own out here," Martha said simply. "You're one of us now, whether you've lived here 5 years or 50. That same afternoon, Tom Bradley stopped by with his teenage daughter Emma. The girl was horse crazy in the way only 15-year-olds could be, her eyes lighting up when she saw Hope, despite the mare's still skeletal condition. "She's beautiful," Emma breathed, and Jake realized she was seeing not what Hope was, but what she would become. "Can I help? I know about horses. I could come by after school, help with feeding and grooming." Her father cleared his throat. "What Emma means is she'll help for free on account of we heard about what you're doing and we'd like to be part of it." Jake looked at these people who barely knew him, offering their time and resources to help save a horse that mattered to no one but him. It was humbling and overwhelming and more than he'd dared to hope for. The community he'd lived on the edges of for 5 years was reaching out, pulling him into the circle, making him belong. "I'd appreciate that more than you know," he said finally. Emma could barely contain her excitement, already planning aloud how she'd help bring Hope back to health. Word spread the way it did in small towns, through church circles and coffee shops, and the endless web of connections that bound rural communities together. By the end of the week, Jake had 3 offers of free hay delivery, a farrier who volunteered to trim Hope's hooves at cost, and a steady stream of visitors who stopped by to check on the mare's progress. Some brought supplies, others brought advice, and a few just brought their presence, standing quietly at the stall door, bearing witness to this small act of salvation playing out in his barn. Not everyone was supportive. Jake ran into his ex-wife's brother at the grocery store, and the man made his opinion clear with a shake of his head and a comment about throwing good money after bad. "Your sister was right about you," the man said, not bothering to lower his voice. "You're too soft-hearted to make it in this world." Jake had simply nodded and pushed his cart past, refusing to engage. He'd learned that some people measured success by bank balances and sensible choices, while others measured it by the lives you touched and the promises you kept. On the 7th day, Hope stood without difficulty for the first time, her legs stronger, her body beginning to respond to the consistent nutrition and care. Doc Stevens came by for a follow-up exam and declared himself cautiously optimistic. "She's got more fight in her than I expected," the old veterinarian said, running his hands over Hope's improving body. "Keep doing what you're doing, Jake. You might just pull this off." That night, Jake sat in the barn watching Hope eat with steady, healthy interest, and calculated the damage to his bank account. He was $3,000 in debt to Doc Stevens, owed Martha for 2 weeks of specialized feed, had maxed out his credit card buying supplements and medical supplies, and his landlord had given him until the end of the month to come up with rent or face eviction. It should have terrified him. Instead, he felt strangely at peace. He'd made a choice to save a life that everyone else had written off. He'd stood up for something that mattered regardless of the personal cost. And in doing so, he'd discovered a community of people who valued the same things he did, who understood that sometimes the most important things couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. His phone rang. It was Ray from the lumberyard. "Jake, I need you back at work tomorrow, or I'm going to have to let you go." Jake looked at Hope, at the progress she'd made, at the life returning to her eyes. "I understand, Ray. I'll be there." He'd figure out the rest somehow. He always did. Returning to work felt like stepping back into a life that no longer fit. Jake clocked in at 6 in the morning, his body exhausted from another night of interrupted sleep, his mind still back at the barn with Hope. He loaded lumber onto trucks, operated the forklift, dealt with contractors who barked orders and customers who changed their minds 3 times about their purchases. The physical labor was familiar, almost meditative, but the hours stretched endlessly, each minute pulling him further from where he wanted to be. Emma had promised to check on Hope during the school day, and Martha said she'd swing by at lunchtime, but Jake couldn't shake the worry that gnawed at him. What if Hope took a turn for the worse? What if she needed him and he wasn't there? He checked his phone obsessively during his breaks, waiting for updates, relief flooding through him each time Emma texted that Hope was doing fine, eating well, seeming stronger. Ray Hutchins watched him with narrowed eyes and a mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Whatever you've got going on outside of work, you need to leave it at the door," he said during Jake's lunch break. "I can't have you distracted when you're operating heavy equipment." "Yes, sir," Jake replied, forcing himself to focus, to be present, to do the job he was being paid to do. But his heart wasn't in it. Not really. His heart was with a white mare who'd stolen it without even trying. The other guys at the lumber yard had heard about Hope through the small-town grapevine. Some ribbed him good-naturedly about his expensive rescue project. "Hey, Morrison," called out Pete Hendricks, "you taking applications for stable hands? I could use that kind of job security, spending other people's money on horses." The joke landed with forced humor, and Jake managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Others were more supportive. Old Carl, who'd worked at the yard for 30 years and had the weathered face to prove it, pulled Jake aside during afternoon break. "My daughter died 6 years ago," Carl said without preamble, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Cancer. She was 23. Right before she passed, she made me promise I'd take care of her horse, this ornery gelding she'd had since she was 16. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "I spent more money than I had keeping that horse fed and healthy for 5 years after she died. People thought I was crazy, wasting resources on an animal. But every time I looked at that horse, I saw my girl smile. I remembered how much joy she got from taking care of something that depended on her." Carl looked at Jake directly then, his gaze sharp and knowing. "What you're doing matters. Don't let anyone tell you different." The conversation stayed with Jake through the rest of his shift and during the drive home. How many people carried these stories, these private acts of love and sacrifice that made no practical sense but mattered more than anything practical ever could? The world wanted to reduce everything to numbers, to profit and loss, to sensible decisions and calculated risks. But some things couldn't be calculated. Some things you did because your soul required it, because walking away would mean losing a piece of yourself you couldn't afford to lose. When he finally made it home, Emma was in the barn with Hope, grooming her with gentle, patient strokes. The transformation in the mare over just 10 days was remarkable. Her coat was beginning to shine where Emma had worked to clean away the matted filth. Her ribs were still visible but less pronounced, her eyes brighter, more alert. She nickered when Jake entered, a sound that never failed to move him, and he felt the tension of the day begin to drain away. "She let me groom her whole left side today," Emma said, her face glowing with accomplishment. "Last week she was too nervous, but now she trusts me. She trusts us." Jake ran his hand along Hope's neck, feeling the warmth of her, the life pulsing through her. "You're doing great work, Emma. I couldn't manage this without you." The girl beamed at the praise, then grew more serious. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to ask you something. What are you going to do with her when she's healthy? I mean, you can't keep her long-term, can you? This property isn't yours, and you're just renting." The question hit harder than Jake expected because he hadn't let himself think that far ahead. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis, on keeping Hope alive through each day, that he hadn't considered what came after survival. What happened when she was healthy and strong and needed more than his small rented barn could provide? "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I've been taking this one day at a time." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "My dad said, if you need help finding her a good home when the time comes, he knows some people. Good people who'd treat her right." The words were kind and practical and utterly devastating because they forced Jake to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. He couldn't keep Hope forever. This rescue had always been temporary, a bridge from death to life, but not a permanent solution. That night, after Emma had gone home and Jake had settled Hope with her evening feed, he sat in his small kitchen and finally opened the stack of bills he'd been avoiding. The numbers were worse than he'd thought. With the money he'd spent on Hope's care, he was now 6 weeks behind on rent. His credit card was maxed out. The utilities were threatening disconnection. He had $300 left in his account and payday wasn't for another week. Even then, his paycheck would barely make a dent in what he owed. He could have made different choices. Could have called animal control that first day and let them handle it. Could have walked away from a problem that wasn't his responsibility. Could have protected his financial stability instead of throwing it away on a romantic gesture that his ex-wife would have called typical Jake, always trying to save something that's already lost. But as he sat there in his quiet kitchen, adding up the cost of doing the right thing, Jake realized something important. He wasn't sorry. Not for a single dollar spent. Not for a single night of interrupted sleep. Not for the complications he'd invited into his already complicated life. Hope had needed him, and he'd answered that need without hesitation. In doing so, he'd discovered reserves of strength he'd forgotten he possessed. He'd found connection and community among people who understood that some things mattered more than money. He'd remembered who he was before divorce, and disappointment had worn him down to someone just trying to survive. Saving Hope had saved something in him too, some essential part of himself that had been dying slowly, forgotten and neglected like the white mare in that abandoned pasture. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen. Jake answered cautiously. "Is this Jake Morrison?" asked a woman's voice, cultured and crisp. "This is Caroline Hendricks. I believe you found a horse on my late father's property." Jake's heart sank. He'd known this call would come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time. "Yes, ma'am, I did. She's been in pretty bad shape, but we're working on getting her healthy." There was a pause, and Jake braced himself for accusations, for legal threats, for demands that he return property that wasn't his to take. "Mr. Morrison," the woman said, her voice softer now, "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Caroline Hendricks spoke for 20 minutes, her words tumbling out with the urgency of someone who'd been carrying guilt for too long. The white mare, she explained, had belonged to her father, a gift he'd purchased for her mother 30 years ago. When her mother died 5 years back, her father had kept the mare out of sentimentality, a living connection to the woman he'd loved for 47 years. After his death, Caroline and her siblings had been so consumed with estate disputes and their own busy lives scattered across the country that they'd arranged for a neighbor to check on the property and feed any animals weekly. That neighbor was supposed to be taking care of her, Caroline said, her voice breaking. We were paying him $200 a month. I called him every few weeks, and he always said everything was fine, that the mare was healthy and well-fed. I had no idea he'd stopped checking months ago. No idea she was suffering like that. Jake listened, his anger at the situation warring with recognition of how easily things could slip through the cracks when people were overwhelmed by grief and distance and the complications of modern life. The neighbor had been pocketing the money while Hope slowly starved, but Caroline and her siblings had trusted him, had believed they were doing the right thing even from far away. I don't know how to make this right, Caroline continued, but I want to try. I understand you've been covering her veterinary care and feeding her. I'd like to reimburse you for everything you've spent. And if you're willing to continue caring for her until we can make permanent arrangements, I'll pay you for your time and effort. The offer should have been a relief. It was exactly what Jake needed. Money to cover the debts he'd accumulated. Recognition that his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. But instead of relief, he felt something twist in his chest. He didn't want to be reimbursed. He didn't want to be paid for time spent. That would reduce what he'd done to a transaction, a service rendered for compensation, when it had been so much more than that. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I didn't do this for money. I did it because your mare was dying and nobody else was there to help. She's getting stronger now, eating well, starting to trust people again. What she needs most is consistency. Someone who'll see her through the rest of her recovery. If you want to help me keep her where she is for now, where she's comfortable and making progress." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Caroline spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. "My father would have liked you, Mr. Morrison. He believed in people who did the right thing simply because it was right, not because there was something in it for them." They talked for another hour, working out the details of an arrangement that felt right to both of them. Caroline would cover all ongoing expenses for Hope's care, would pay Jake's back rent so he didn't lose his house, and would compensate him fairly for his time. But more importantly, she gave him something he hadn't dared to hope for. When Hope was fully recovered, if Jake wanted to keep her permanently, Caroline would sign over ownership to him. "My siblings and I have been fighting over that property for 2 years," she said. "We can't agree on whether to sell it or develop it or keep it, but we can all agree that this mare deserves better than to be a bargaining chip in our disputes. If you want her, she's yours. No strings attached." After they hung up, Jake sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. The crushing financial pressure that had been suffocating him was suddenly lifted. More than that, he had a future with Hope, a real future, not just a temporary rescue that would end with her being shipped off to strangers. He walked out to the barn where Hope was dozing in her stall, and when she heard him approach, she lifted her head and nickered softly. "Hey girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Looks like you're stuck with me after all." The next morning, Jake woke to find his bank account transformed. Caroline had wired the money overnight, enough to cover his debts and provide a cushion for Hope's ongoing care. It felt surreal, like waking from a nightmare to discover it had only been a dream. He paid his landlord, settled his credit card, caught up on utilities, and still had money left over. For the first time in months, he could breathe without the constant weight of financial panic pressing down on his chest. Word of Caroline's generosity spread through town, with the same speed as news of Jake's initial rescue had traveled. At the feed store, Martha refused his payment for the feed she'd given him on credit. "You keep that money for the mare," she said firmly. "What you did inspired this whole town. Let us be part of it." At the lumber yard, even Ray Hutchins seemed to soften slightly, gruffly mentioning that Jake could take a longer lunch break if he needed to check on his horse. The phrase his horse sent a thrill through Jake that he couldn't quite explain. Emma doubled down on her efforts to help with Hope's care, showing up every day after school with a dedication that reminded Jake of himself at that age. The girl had a natural way with horses, gentle but confident, reading Hope's moods and needs with intuitive accuracy. "She's going to be beautiful when she fills out," Emma said one afternoon, carefully working through a tangle in Hope's mane. "I can see it already. She's got good bone structure, a noble head. Someone bred her for quality once upon a time. Jake could see it too." As the weeks passed and Hope continued to improve, her true nature emerged. She was intelligent and curious, with a playful streak that showed itself in small ways. The way she'd steal his hat if he got too close, how she'd nuzzle his pockets looking for the peppermints he'd started carrying. She had opinions too, clear preferences about which side she wanted groomed first, which bucket she preferred for water, whether she wanted company or solitude at any given moment. She was becoming not just a horse, but a personality, an individual with quirks and charms that made Jake fall a little more in love with her every day. Doc Stevens came by for a checkup 6 weeks after the initial rescue and declared himself amazed by Hope's progress. "I didn't think she'd make it through the first week," he admitted, running his hands over her much improved body. "You've done remarkable work here, Jake. This mare's going to have a good long life ahead of her thanks to you." The veterinarian paused, then added with a slight smile, "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said you had the gift with horses, that special something that can't be taught." Looks like he was right. That night, Jake stood in the barn watching Hope eat her dinner with healthy enthusiasm and tried to remember the man he'd been before finding her. That man had been lost, adrift, going through the motions of life without real purpose or connection. He'd been surviving but not living, existing in the hollow space left behind by divorce and disappointment. Saving Hope had given him back something essential, had reminded him that he was capable of more than just survival. He was capable of sacrifice and dedication and the kind of stubborn love that refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, his ex-wife. Her brother had apparently told her about the Mare situation. The message was brief and cutting, classic Sarah. "I heard about your horse rescue. Glad you finally found something to commit to." The words were designed to hurt, to remind him of their failed marriage, of all the ways she'd found him lacking. But instead of pain, Jake felt only pity. Sarah had never understood that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight was hard. That commitment meant showing up, especially when it cost you something. She'd wanted guarantees and security and a life that made sense on paper. He'd wanted something messier and more meaningful, something that couldn't be calculated or controlled. He deleted the message without responding and looked at Hope, at this magnificent creature who'd been left to die and had chosen to fight for life instead. "You and me both, girl," he said softly. "We're survivors, and we're going to be just fine." 3 months after Jake found Hope in that abandoned pasture, spring arrived in Montana with its characteristic blend of promise and unpredictability. The snow melted in rushing streams, revealing the brown grass beneath, and the world seemed awake from a long sleep. Hope had transformed in ways that Jake could hardly believe when he looked back at the skeletal creature he'd first encountered. Her white coat now gleamed with health, her body had filled out to show the powerful musculature of a well-bred mare, and her eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. She'd gained nearly 300 pounds, and Doc Stevens declared her one of the most remarkable recoveries he'd witnessed in 40 years of veterinary practice. Jake had transformed too, though in less visible ways. The hollow feeling that had haunted him since his divorce had been replaced by something solid and sustaining. He woke each morning with purpose, spent his lunch breaks planning training exercises for Hope, and fell asleep at night with the satisfaction of meaningful work accomplished. Emma still came by after school most days, and together they'd begun teaching Hope to trust again, to accept handling and grooming without fear, to remember that human hands could offer kindness instead of neglect. On a Saturday morning in late March, Tom Bradley showed up at Jake's barn with a horse trailer and a proposition. Jake was working with Hope in the small paddock he'd built, teaching her to respond to voice commands when Tom's truck rolled up the drive. The older man climbed out slowly, his eyes taking in the scene before him with obvious approval. "She's looking good, Jake. Real good. You've done right by her." "Thank you," Jake replied, curious about the reason for this visit. Tom wasn't the type to drop by without purpose. "I've got an offer for you," Tom said, getting straight to the point. "My neighbor's selling his property, 40 acres with a house, barn, and good fencing. Been thinking about downsizing since my wife passed, and that place would suit a man with a horse better than this rental setup you've got here." The suggestion caught Jake off guard. Tom continued before he could respond. "I know you don't have money for a down payment, not after everything you've spent on Hope, but I do. I could front you the down payment as a loan, and the mortgage payments would probably run you less than what you're paying in rent here. You'd own something, build equity, have room for Hope to really stretch her legs." Jake's first instinct was to refuse. He'd already accepted so much help, had already leaned on the kindness of others more than his pride was comfortable with. But Tom held up a hand, anticipating his objection. "Before you say no, hear me out. You saved that mare's life when nobody else would. You did it at great personal cost, and you did it because it was the right thing to do. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." This isn't charity, Jake. It's an investment in the kind of person this community needs more of. Besides, he added with a slight smile, Emma would never forgive me if I let you pass up the chance to give Hope a real home. The property was everything Tom had described and more. The house was small but solid, a 2-bedroom ranch with good bones and a wood stove that reminded Jake of his grandfather's place. The barn was spacious with 3 stalls and a tack room, and the fencing was in good repair. The land rolled gently toward a creek lined with cottonwoods, and Jake could already picture Hope grazing there, free and safe and home. The owner, a widower named Frank Peterson, was moving to Arizona to be near his daughter. He'd loved the property but could no longer maintain it alone, and he seemed genuinely pleased by the idea of it going to someone who'd use it for its intended purpose. Jake walked the fence line, tested the barn doors, examined the house's foundation, all the practical things a man should consider when making such a significant decision. But what really sold him was the way Hope reacted when he led her onto the property for the first time. Her ears pricked forward with interest, her nostrils flared as she took in new scents, and she moved with an eagerness he'd never seen before, as if she recognized that this place could be theirs. When he unclipped her lead rope in the paddock and let her explore, she trotted around the perimeter with her tail high, then rolled in the grass with what could only be described as joy. Tom watched from the fence and chuckled. Looks like she's made her decision. What about you? The paperwork was completed within a month. Caroline Hendricks, true to her word, had transferred ownership of Hope to Jake with no strings attached, and she'd even contributed to the property purchase, saying it eased her conscience to know the Mare would have a proper home. The day Jake got the keys to his new property, he drove straight to the barn where Hope had been staying and loaded her into Tom's trailer. "This is it, girl," he told her as they drove toward their new home. "No more renting, no more temporary arrangements. This is ours." Emma helped him move his few possessions, which didn't take long. A bed, a couch, some kitchen supplies, boxes of books that had been in storage since the divorce. The house felt empty at first, echoing with the absence of the life he'd once imagined filling it. But as he set up Hope's stall with fresh bedding, as he filled the water trough and hung hay nets, as he watched her settle into her new space with obvious contentment, the emptiness began to feel less like loss and more like potential. This was a fresh start, a chance to build something new from the ground up. That first night in his own home, Jake sat on the porch steps watching the sun set over his own land, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the resignation he'd felt before finding Hope, not the mere absence of anxiety, but genuine peace. The kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. Hope grazed in the paddock, her white coat golden in the evening light, and occasionally she'd lift her head to look toward the porch, checking that he was still there, still watching over her. His phone rang, and he almost didn't answer, reluctant to break the perfect stillness of the moment. But it was Doc Stevens, and the old veterinarian rarely called without good reason. "Jake," the vet said without preamble, "I've got a situation I thought you might be interested in. There's a gelding over in Billings. Owner died and the family wants nothing to do with him. He's not in as bad shape as Hope was, but he's heading that direction. They're talking about sending him to auction, which probably means slaughter. I know you just got settled, but I thought maybe, if you had the space." Jake looked at his barn with its 3 stalls, at the 40 acres that could easily support multiple horses, at Hope, who'd been alone for too long and might benefit from equine company. He thought about the man he'd been 3 months ago, barely surviving, and the man he'd become, someone who'd discovered that saving one life had the power to transform your own. "How soon do they need an answer?" he asked. Doc Stevens' voice carried audible relief. "End of the week, I'll send you the details." "I'll send." Jake hung up and looked at Hope again. She'd wandered closer to the fence and she nickered softly, that sound that still melted something in his chest every time he heard it. "What do you think, girl? Got room in your life for a friend?" The next morning, Jake called the family in Billings and arranged to see the gelding. He was a buckskin, about 15 years old, thin but not critical, with kind eyes and a gentle disposition that reminded Jake painfully of what Hope must have been like before neglect had taught her to fear. The family was eager to be rid of the responsibility, and they accepted Jake's offer without negotiation. By the weekend, there were 2 horses in his barn, Hope and the buckskin he'd named Chance because that's what he'd been given. One more chance at a life worth living. Emma was the first to notice the change in Hope after Chance arrived. The white mare had always been gentle with humans, grateful for the care and attention, but there'd been a wariness in her eyes, a tension in her body that spoke of remembered trauma. With Chance in the neighboring stall, something softened in Hope. She'd whinny to him in the mornings, her ears forward with interest, and when Jake turned them both out in the paddock, they'd graze side by side with the comfortable companionship of old friends, even though they'd just met. "It's like she's finally relaxing," Emma observed, watching the 2 horses from the fence rail, "like she knows she's not alone anymore." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what the girl meant. He'd felt that same relief when the community had rallied around him during Hope's rescue, that profound comfort of knowing you weren't facing life's challenges in isolation. Animals needed that too. The presence of their own kind, the unspoken understanding that could only come from shared experience. Word of Jake's growing rescue operation spread faster than he'd anticipated. Within 2 weeks of bringing Chance home, he received 3 more calls about horses in difficult situations. An elderly mare whose owner had entered a nursing home, a young stallion that had become too much for his inexperienced owner to handle, a pair of ponies being starved by an owner who'd lost his job and his ability to feed them properly. Jake couldn't take them all, didn't have the space or resources, but he started making calls, connecting people who needed to rehome horses with people who had the means and desire to provide good homes. Tom Bradley started calling him the horse matchmaker, and the nickname stuck. Jake found he had a talent for reading both horses and people, for understanding what kind of personality would suit which animal, for seeing potential where others saw only problems. The young stallion went to a trainer who specialized in difficult horses and had the experience to channel his energy productively. The elderly mare found a home with a retired couple who wanted a gentle companion for trail rides. The ponies went to a therapeutic riding program that could use them to help children with disabilities. By summer, Jake's property had become an unofficial way station for horses in transition. He'd take them in, provide basic care and rehabilitation if needed, evaluate their temperaments and abilities, then find them appropriate permanent homes. He never charged for this service, though people often insisted on contributing to feed costs or paying Doc Stevens directly for veterinary care. The work was satisfying in ways his job at the lumberyard had never been, and he found himself staying up late researching equine nutrition, training techniques, and rescue protocols. Ray Hutchins noticed Jake's divided attention and called him into the office one Monday morning. His boss's expression was unreadable as he gestured for Jake to sit. "Morrison, I'm going to be straight with you. Your mind hasn't been fully on this job for months now." Jake opened his mouth to defend himself, but Ray held up a hand. "I'm not criticizing. I'm stating a fact. You show up, you do the work, but your heart's somewhere else." Jake couldn't deny it. "Yes, sir. That's probably fair." "What I want to know is," Ray leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with those shrewd eyes, "do you have a plan, or are you just drifting?" The question forced Jake to articulate something he'd been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't dared to voice aloud. "I want to build a proper rescue operation. Not just taking in horses temporarily, but creating a real sanctuary where they can stay as long as they need to. Where I can do rehabilitation work and training. Maybe offer riding lessons to help cover costs." Maybe work with at-risk kids, teach them about responsibility and care through working with animals. Ray was quiet for a long moment. "That's a good dream," he said finally. "Ambitious, expensive, probably going to fail a dozen times before you figure out how to make it work. But it's a good dream." He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote something on it. "This is my brother-in-law. He runs a non-profit foundation that funds community projects in rural areas. Give him a call, tell him I sent you. Can't promise anything, but he might be able to help with startup funding." The conversation with Ray's brother-in-law, Michael Chen, took place over coffee at the local diner a week later. Michael was a businessman from Seattle who'd made his fortune in tech and now devoted his time and resources to supporting rural communities that reminded him of where he'd grown up. He listened to Jake's vision with interest, asking sharp questions about business models, sustainability, and community impact. "What makes you think you can succeed where so many horse rescues fail?" he asked, not unkindly. "They run out of money, run out of space, burn out from the emotional toll of seeing suffering they can't fix." Jake thought about hope, about that first night when he'd decided to spend his rent money on a dying mare. "I don't know if I can succeed," he admitted, "but I know I have to try. Every horse I've helped find a home, every animal I've been able to save, it's reminded me that individual actions matter, that one person choosing to care can make a difference. I'm not naive enough to think I can save them all, but I can save the ones who cross my path, and maybe in doing so, I can inspire others to do the same." Michael studied him over his coffee cup, then smiled. "That's the right answer. Let me talk to my foundation board. I think we can work something out." The grant came through 6 weeks later, $50,000 to establish Morrison Horse Rescue as a registered nonprofit. The money came with conditions, requirements for quarterly reports and financial transparency, expectations for community involvement and educational programming. But it also came with validation, proof that Jake's dream wasn't just foolish idealism, but something with real value and potential. He hired a lawyer to handle the nonprofit paperwork, worked with an accountant to set up proper bookkeeping systems, and spent evenings designing programs that would serve both horses and humans. Emma became his first official volunteer, and she recruited 3 of her friends from school. Tom Bradley joined his board of directors, along with Doc Stevens and Martha from the feed store. They met monthly at Jake's kitchen table, drinking coffee and planning the future of something that had started with one man's impulsive decision to help a dying horse. Hope and Chance watched from the paddock as construction crews arrived to expand the barn, adding 4 more stalls and a covered arena where Jake could work with horses regardless of weather. The white mare had become something of a mascot for the rescue, her transformation from near death to thriving health serving as proof of what was possible with proper care and dedication. People would come just to see her, to touch her soft nose and hear the story of how she'd been saved. On the day the new barn was completed, Jake stood in the center of the arena and looked around at what his impulsive act of compassion had grown into. A real rescue facility, a place where horses could heal and humans could learn, where the connection between species could be honored and nurtured. His grandfather would have understood this, would have recognized it as the fulfillment of lessons taught so many years ago. "A man takes care of what's his," the old man used to say, and sometimes what's his is anything that needs taking care of. That evening, as the sun set over his 40 acres, Jake sat on the fence watching Hope and Chance graze together. The white mare lifted her head and looked directly at him, and he could swear he saw recognition in her eyes, understanding of how far they'd both come from that November day when their lives had intersected. She'd saved him as surely as he'd saved her, had given him purpose when he'd been drifting, had shown him that his capacity for love and commitment hadn't died with his marriage but had only been waiting for the right focus. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "There's a horse in Helena that needs help. Owner's moving and can't take her. Can we go look tomorrow?" Jake smiled and typed back his response. "Of course, We'll take the trailer. Because that's what they did now. They helped. They saved. They gave second chances to animals who'd been let down by humans, and in doing so, they reminded themselves and their community that kindness still mattered, that individual actions still had the power to change the world, one rescued soul at a time. The call came on a Thursday evening in late August, just as Jake was finishing the evening feeding. The voice on the other end was young, female, and trembling with barely contained emotion. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Beth Carver. I got your number from Dr. Stevens. He said you might be able to help with something." Jake set down the feed bucket and gave her his full attention. "I'll certainly try. What's going on?" There was a long pause, the sound of someone gathering courage to speak difficult truths. "My father died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack. He had 7 horses, and I don't know what to do with them. I live in California, I can't take them, and the property's going into foreclosure. The bank's giving me 2 weeks to clear everything out, 7 horses. Jake felt the weight of that number settle on his shoulders. His facility could handle maybe 3 more long-term, and that would be pushing capacity. But the desperation in Beth's voice reminded him of Caroline Hendricks, another daughter overwhelmed by the sudden loss of a parent and the impossible responsibility of dealing with livestock she couldn't keep. "Where are they now?" he asked. "Still on my dad's property outside of Great Falls. A neighbor's been feeding them, but he can't keep doing it much longer." "Are they in good condition?" Beth's voice cracked slightly. "Honestly, I don't know enough about horses to tell you. They look okay to me, but I wouldn't know if something was wrong. Could you come look at them? Help me figure out what to do?" Jake drove to Great Falls the next morning, Emma riding shotgun. The girl had become indispensable to the rescue operation, her natural gift with horses matched by a surprising head for the practical side of running a nonprofit. She'd created a social media presence for Morrison Horse Rescue that had attracted followers from across the state, and she managed the volunteer schedule with efficiency that belied her 16 years. As they drove, Emma scrolled through her phone, already reaching out to potential foster homes and permanent adopters. "We might be able to place 3 or 4 of them quickly if they're trained and healthy," she said. "The others we can bring back to the facility temporarily while we look for homes." Beth Carver was waiting for them at the property, a small ranch that showed signs of recent neglect. She was about 30, dressed in business casual that looked out of place against the rural backdrop, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you for coming," she said, shaking Jake's hand with desperate gratitude. "I didn't know who else to call. My dad loved these horses more than anything. I can't just send them to auction." The 7 horses were in the barn in attached paddocks, and Jake's practiced eye assessed them quickly. They were all in decent condition, clearly loved and well cared for during their owner's life. There was a matched pair of draft horses, massive and gentle, a quarter-horse mare with intelligent eyes, 2 younger geldings, and a smaller pony that had probably been someone's childhood companion. The 7th horse made Jake's breath catch. She was a paint mare, maybe 20 years old, with a distinctive pattern of brown and white patches, and eyes that held the same weary wisdom he'd seen in Hope's eyes that first day. Beth followed his gaze. "That's Sadie. She was my dad's favorite. He'd had her since I was in middle school. I used to ride her when I'd visit, before I got too busy with my career to come home much." Her voice broke on the last words, and Jake understood the guilt he heard there, the regret of time not spent, visits not made, priorities that seemed important until someone was gone and it was too late to rearrange them. The paint mare walked over to the fence and nudged Beth's hand gently, and the woman began to cry in earnest. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have come home more. I should have been here." Jake gave her a moment, then spoke gently. "Your father knew you loved him, and he'd want these horses taken care of, which is exactly what you're trying to do. Let me make some calls, see what I can arrange." Over the next few hours, Jake and Emma worked their network of contacts. The draft horses went to a logging operation that still used traditional methods, owners who promised to treat them as partners rather than equipment. The quarter-horse mare caught the interest of a therapeutic riding program that needed a steady, reliable mount for their intermediate riders. The two geldings were claimed by separate families looking for trail horses. The pony found a home with a family whose daughter was just the right age to appreciate a gentle first horse. That left Sadie, the paint mare who was too old for most people to want, too tied to painful memories for Beth to keep. "I'll take her," Jake heard himself say. "We've got room at the sanctuary, and horses her age do well with a stable environment and consistent care." Beth looked at him with such profound relief that Jake felt his throat tighten. "Really? You'd do that?" "She's old, and I know that means expensive vet bills and maybe not much time left. That's exactly why she needs a good place to spend whatever time she has," Jake replied. "Every horse deserves to live out their days with dignity and care. Sadie's no different." Emma was already on her phone, updating the rescue's social media with photos of Sadie and her story. Within an hour, they had 3 sponsorship offers from people willing to help cover her care costs, and a dozen comments from followers praising Jake for taking on a senior horse that others would have overlooked. They transported Sadie back to the sanctuary that evening, and Jake led her into the barn where Hope and Chance and the other residents were already settling in for the night. Hope lifted her head with interest, watching as Jake got the new mare situated in a stall near hers. For a moment, the white mare and the paint mare looked at each other, and Jake could swear he saw understanding pass between them. They were both survivors, both beneficiaries of second chances, both living proof that it was never too late to start over. Sadie settled into her new home with remarkable ease, as if she sensed that this place was different, that here she would be valued for who she was rather than what she could do. That night, sitting on his porch with a beer and the satisfaction of a hard day's work well done, Jake thought about the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he'd been a divorced man barely scraping by, purposeless and adrift. Then he'd found a dying white mare and made an impulsive choice to help her. That choice had led to another choice and another, until he'd built something bigger than he'd ever imagined possible. A sanctuary that now housed 8 horses, a non-profit with genuine community support, a purpose that got him out of bed eager to face each day. His phone rang, and he answered to hear Doc Stevens's familiar gravelly voice. "Jake, I've got a situation. There's a horse trailer that rolled on the interstate near Butte. 3 horses injured, owners didn't make it. The surviving animals need somewhere to go while their injuries heal, and the family can't afford specialized care." Jake closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar pull of need-meeting ability. "How bad are the injuries?" "Treatable," Doc replied, "but it'll require daily care and monitoring. I'd do it myself, but I don't have the facilities. You do." "When do you need an answer?" Jake asked, though he already knew what his response would be. The old veterinarian chuckled. "I already told them you'd help. Just wanted to give you a heads up that we're bringing them tomorrow morning." Jake shook his head, smiling despite the new burden being added to his already full plate. "You're getting awfully presumptuous in your old age, Doc." "I'm presuming on your character, son," Doc Stevens replied warmly, "and I haven't been wrong yet." After they hung up, Jake walked out to the barn one more time. Hope was dozing in her stall, one hip cocked in relaxation, the picture of contentment and health. He reached over the stall door to stroke her neck, and she leaned into his touch with a soft sigh. "We're getting 3 more tomorrow," he told her. "Injured, scared, grieving the loss of their people. Loss. You know what that's like, don't you, girl? Knowing what it's like to be alone and hurt and wondering if anyone cares." Hope opened one eye and looked at him, and Jake could swear she understood every word. Winter arrived early that year, catching Montana in its grip by mid-October with a ferocity that tested even the most prepared ranchers. Jake woke one morning to find 6 inches of snow on the ground and temperatures hovering near zero. The barn's heating system, which had been functioning fine the day before, had died sometime in the night, and 11 horses needed immediate warmth and care. He worked frantically with Emma and Tom Bradley to get space heaters running, to ensure water troughs hadn't frozen solid, to check each animal for signs of cold stress. By noon, they had the situation under control, but Jake's bank account had taken another hit from the emergency repairs. The financial strain was becoming harder to ignore. The grant money had covered initial setup costs, but ongoing operations required constant fundraising. Feed bills alone ran $3,000 monthly, and that was before veterinary care, facility maintenance, and the 100 other expenses that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Jake had cut his hours at the lumber yard to focus more on the rescue, which meant his personal income had dropped significantly. He was making it work, barely, through a combination of small donations, sponsorships, and his own stubborn refusal to give up. Martha called him into her office at the feed store on a gray November afternoon. "Jake," she said without preamble, "your account's running high. I know you're good for it eventually, but I need to see some payment soon. I've got my own bills to cover." Jake nodded, feeling the familiar weight of financial pressure settle on his shoulders. "I understand. Give me 2 weeks. I've got some sponsorship money coming in, and there's a fundraiser event Emma's organizing." Martha's expression softened slightly. "I believe in what you're doing. Truly, I do. But belief doesn't pay my suppliers." 2 weeks, Jake repeated, hoping he wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. That evening, Emma found him in the barn, staring at the budget spreadsheet on his laptop, with the kind of intensity usually reserved for complex mathematical proofs. The numbers weren't adding up no matter how many times he recalculated them. Even with perfect fundraising results, even with every sponsorship renewed, they were going to come up short. Not catastrophically short, but enough that it kept him awake at night, worrying. "Mr. Morrison," Emma said softly, making him look up from the screen. "You're doing that thing where you try to carry everything yourself again." Jake managed a tired smile. "Someone has to worry about whether we can keep the lights on." "That's what boards of directors are for," she replied with the practical wisdom that never ceased to amaze him. "Have you talked to Tom or Dr. Stevens about this?" The board meeting that followed was both humbling and encouraging. Tom Bradley listened to Jake's financial concerns, then pulled out his checkbook. "I'm writing a check for $5,000. Doc Stevens matched it immediately. Martha, attending as a community member rather than board member, committed to extending more credit. But it was what they said after the money was pledged that struck Jake most deeply. "You've built something important here," Tom said. "Something this community needs. But you can't do it alone, and you shouldn't have to. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to admit you're struggling. Those are the lessons you teach through your work with these horses. Maybe it's time to apply them to yourself." The fundraiser Emma had organized turned into something bigger than Jake had imagined possible. The community rallied with the same energy they'd shown when hope first needed saving. Local businesses donated items for a silent auction. A restaurant provided food. The high school band played. People came from 3 counties to walk through the sanctuary, meet the horses, and hear their stories. Hope, brushed to gleaming perfection by Emma, became the star of the event. Children lined up to pet her, adults asked to take photos, and Jake found himself telling her story over and over. Each time he recounted finding her in that abandoned pasture, spending his rent money to save her life, watching her transform from dying to thriving. He saw people's expressions change. Understanding dawned in their eyes, recognition that one person's choice to care could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. The fundraiser brought in $12,000, enough to stabilize their immediate finances and create a small cushion for emergencies. But more valuable than the money was the renewed sense of community investment in the rescue's mission. 20 new people signed up as monthly sponsors, and 15 volunteers committed to regular shifts, helping with barn chores and horse care. Jake realized he'd been trying to be self-sufficient in a way that actually limited the rescue's potential. By opening up, by showing vulnerability and need, he'd allowed others to become truly invested in the work. Sarah called him the day after the fundraiser. His ex-wife's voice was different from the last time they'd spoken, less bitter, more thoughtful. "I saw the article about your rescue in the paper," she said. "The picture of you with that white mare. You look happy, Jake. Happier than you ever looked with me." The observation wasn't cruel, just honest, and Jake found he could accept it without defensiveness. "I am happy," he admitted. "This work, these horses, this community, it fits me in a way nothing else ever has." There was a pause, then Sarah spoke again, her voice softer. "I'm glad you found your purpose. I'm sorry I couldn't be part of it." "That's not on you," Jake replied. "We wanted different things. That doesn't make either of us wrong, just incompatible. I hope you're happy too." After they hung up, Jake felt something release inside him, some last piece of bitterness or regret finally letting go. His marriage had failed, but that failure had led him to this place, to this work, to this life that felt authentically his in ways nothing before ever had. Maybe everything happened exactly as it needed to. Maybe finding hope when he did, with his life in shambles and his future uncertain, had been perfect timing rather than terrible timing. Maybe you had to lose everything before you could discover what really mattered. December brought a Christmas program that Emma organized with the help of the sanctuary's youngest volunteers. Children read poems about the rescued horses, sang carols in the barn while the animals watched with patient interest, and helped decorate the facility with lights and wreaths. Hope wore a Santa hat that kept sliding over her eyes, making everyone laugh. Jake stood back watching, overwhelmed by how something that started with one impulsive act of compassion had grown into this, a full community gathered to celebrate not just a holiday, but a shared commitment to kindness and care. That night, after everyone had gone home and the sanctuary was quiet except for the soft sounds of horses settling for the night, Jake walked through the barn, checking each animal one final time. 11 horses now, each with their own story of loss and rescue, each representing someone's choice to help rather than look away. He stopped at Hope's stall last, and she greeted him with her familiar nicker, pressing her nose into his hand. "You started all of this," he told her quietly. "One dying mare in an abandoned field, and look what grew from saving you. Look at what you taught me about what matters, about who I want to be." Hope's dark eyes reflected the barn lights, and in them Jake saw not just a horse, but a mirror showing him the man he'd become, someone who chose compassion over caution, who valued life over money, who understood that the most important things couldn't be calculated in spreadsheets or measured by conventional success. Someone who'd learned that saving one life could save your own. The one-year anniversary of finding Hope fell on a crisp November morning that reminded Jake eerily of that first day. He woke early, as had become his habit, and walked out to the barn while frost still glittered on the grass and his breath made clouds in the cold air. The barn was warm now, properly heated and insulated, filled with the sounds of horses stirring awake. 14 residents now called Morrison Horse Rescue home, some temporary while they awaited adoption, others permanent sanctuary cases who would live out their days here. Hope met him at her stall door, as she did every morning, nickering her greeting and pressing her soft nose into his hand. She was magnificent now, her white coat gleaming with health, her body strong and powerful, her eyes bright with contentment. Looking at her, it was almost impossible to believe she'd once been the skeletal creature he'd found dying in that abandoned pasture, almost, except Jake carried the memory of that day etched into his heart, a reminder of how fragile life was and how much difference one person's choice could make. Emma had organized a small celebration for the anniversary, inviting everyone who'd been part of Hope's rescue and recovery. Doc Stevens arrived first, his old veterinary truck rattling up the drive at 9 sharp. The vet walked straight to Hope's stall, running his experienced hands over her body one more time, and shook his head in wonder. In 40 years of practice, I've never seen a more complete recovery. You did something special here, Jake. Not just saving her life, but giving her a reason to want to live. That makes all the difference. Tom Bradley came next, bringing his daughter Emma and a homemade banner that read, "Hope's Second Chance 1 year later." Martha from the feed store arrived with a cake shaped like a horse, and Caroline Hendricks flew in from Chicago, wanting to see in person what her contribution had helped create. People kept coming throughout the morning, neighbors and volunteers, board members and sponsors, children who'd learned to respect animals through programs at the sanctuary, adults who'd found healing in the quiet work of caring for damaged creatures. Jake stood on his porch watching the gathering, feeling overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief. A year ago, he'd had $375, a failing marriage behind him, and no clear purpose ahead. He'd been surviving but not living, existing in the hollow space left by disappointment and loss. Then hope had appeared in his life, dying and desperate, and everything had changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but gradually, choice by choice, day by day, until he'd become someone he actually recognized and respected. The celebration moved to the barn, where Emma had set up chairs facing Hope's stall. People told stories about their own experiences with the rescue, about horses they'd adopted or fostered, about lessons learned through the simple act of caring for animals who couldn't speak their needs but communicated them nonetheless. A teenager named Marcus, who'd been court-ordered to complete community service at the sanctuary after a vandalism charge, stood up and spoke with halting honesty about how working with the horses had taught him patience and responsibility. "Watching them heal made me want to heal too," he said, and several people wiped tears from their eyes. Caroline Hendricks spoke about her father, about how much the white mare had meant to him and her mother, about the guilt she'd carried over Hope's neglect and the redemption she'd found in helping Jake build this sanctuary. "Your refusal to give up on her when everyone else had forgotten she existed," she said, looking directly at Jake. "That reminded me that it's never too late to do the right thing. That's a lesson I needed to learn, and one I'll carry with me the rest of my life." When it was Jake's turn to speak, he found himself struggling to articulate what the past year had meant. He looked at Hope standing calm and content in her stall, and felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he thought about how close they'd both come to missing this connection. "I spent my rent money to save her," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Everyone who knew me thought I was crazy. My ex-wife certainly did. I was broke, alone, barely holding my life together, and I took on the responsibility of a dying horse I had no business trying to save." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But you know what? That crazy, impractical, financially irresponsible decision was the best choice I ever made. Not because it made logical sense, but because it was right. Because when you see suffering and you have the ability to help, choosing to walk away costs you something too. It costs you a piece of your humanity." The sanctuary now served 40 horses annually, providing emergency care, rehabilitation, fostering, and permanent sanctuary as needed. Jake had quit his job at the lumberyard 6 months ago, finally able to draw a modest salary from the nonprofit. It wasn't much, but it was enough to live on, especially combined with the free housing he received as resident manager of the sanctuary. Emma had been accepted to veterinary school with plans to specialize in equine medicine and return to work with the rescue after graduation. 3 other young people from the community had found their calling through volunteering at the sanctuary, choosing careers in animal welfare and nonprofit management. The ripple effects of saving Hope extended far beyond the individual lives touched. Local schools now brought classes to the sanctuary for humane education programs. The county had adopted more stringent animal welfare ordinances after seeing the conditions Hope had survived. 2 other horse rescues had opened in neighboring counties, inspired by Morrison's success. The local news had done a feature story that attracted state and even some national attention, but for Jake, the real measure of success wasn't the programs or publicity or even the number of horses saved. It was simpler than that. It was the way Hope would rest her head on his shoulder when he stood beside her, the trust that said she knew she was safe and loved. It was the satisfaction of watching a neglected animal rediscover joy in being alive. It was the community of people who'd rallied around a shared commitment to compassion. It was the knowledge that he'd found his purpose not through careful planning or logical decision-making, but through one impulsive act of kindness that had transformed his entire life. As the celebration wound down and people began to leave, Jake stayed in the barn with Hope. The white mare dozed contentedly, one hip cocked, surrounded by other rescued horses who'd found sanctuary here. Jake thought about the cowboy he'd been a year ago, desperate and lost, and the cowboy he was now, purposeful and connected. All because of this magnificent creature who'd been left to die and had chosen to fight for life instead. "Thank you," he whispered, stroking her neck, "for letting me save you, for saving me right back." Hope opened one eye and looked at him with what Jake could only describe as understanding. Then she closed her eye again and went back to dozing, secure in the knowledge that she was home, that she was loved, that she would never be abandoned again. And Jake stood beside her, equally secure in those same truths, knowing that sometimes the best things in life came not from playing it safe, but from risking everything for something that mattered. One starving white mare had taught him that lesson, and he would carry it with him for the rest of his days.